How's this sounding, Kate? It's good? Okay, great. I am going to go ahead and start with an introduction. I see a lot of folks still grabbing coffee, and so we'll have more people coming in probably once they start hearing my voice. And I apologize for any echo, but it sounds like it's working great. Okay, thank you, Kate, master of audio visual. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Beal, and I'm excited to invite you to this fourth and final session of, I'm going to pin Davis so we're not looking at ourselves. Where's the pin? There it is. Excited to invite you to our fourth and final session on the biblical prophets and the prophetic imagination. And I'm really excited to introduce my colleague and friend, Davis Hankins. Davis is an associate professor of religious studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, and he's also the newly appointed director of the Center for Judaic, Holocaust, and Peace Studies, say that 5 times fast, at Appalachian State University. His scholarship focuses on the intersection of political economy, religion, and the ancient Near East, literature of the ancient Near East, especially biblical literature, but other ancient Near Eastern literatures as well. In addition to many articles and edited books, he has authored a book called The Book of Job and the Imminent Genesis of Transcendence, which is just immediately makes sense to all of us what that book is about. You should read it. It's really, really powerful and insightful, and a window into a very complex and insightful and thoughtful mind as well. His next book, which I have to look at my text from Davis where he told me the title for it, is called Underground Current, the Ptolemaic Administrative Imaginary. He also works very closely with our teacher and mentor, Walter Brueggemann. Davis and I and Clover both went to Columbia Theological Seminary, where we studied with Walter, and we both went to Emory after that and studied with Carol Newsom, so we have a lot in common. But Davis has done a lot with Walter Brueggemann since. He is the editor of the Walter Brueggemann Library, so a series of books by Brueggemann that Davis has edited, and I think this is a big distinction. He wrote the foreword for the 40th anniversary edition of The Prophetic Imagination, which is arguably, it certainly is one of Walter's most important books. He teaches courses on Hebrew Bible, Judaism, New Testament, as well as topical courses on gender and sexuality, visual art and religion, and not coincidentally, prophets and justice, which is our topic for today. And he showed me a new title just now, and I forgot to write it down, but what we had been calling it was Biblical Prophets, Social Justice, and Hope in and Beyond the Book of Amos. And we'll see the new title as soon as Davis shares his screen. So please join me in welcoming Davis Hankins.
although I'll jump around here or there. The prophetic book of Amos, who was an 8th century prophet. So there are 4 prophets in the Hebrew Bible with books named after them that I have there on the screen. Amos, Hosea, prophesied in the northern kingdom of Israel, Isaiah and Micah in the southern kingdom of Judah. And yet they were all relatively contemporaneous prophets with different messages, all speaking at a time of great crisis and in ways that are different, and the ways where those differences are interesting. So we're not going to get into how Amos differs from Hosea, for example, and we'll just focus on Amos. But just so you know, these prophets did not succeed one another consecutively. Sometimes you have multiple voices speaking to the same circumstances, and that creates interesting opportunities for comparison. So Amos begins in chapter 1, verse 1, like the narrative in Star Wars that begins the Star Wars movies or something like that, where prophetic books tend to begin with an editorial comment that situates the prophet into a place and time, and then you dive into the properly diegetic space of the film, to use a film term. So we begin with this introduction in 1:1 to the words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of, and then you get 2 kings listed because remember, as Tim said, there are 2 separate kingdoms with 2 separate capital cities and 2 separate kings, one in the north, Israel, one in the south, Judah. So we are told that Amos prophesied during the days of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam of Israel, and there you can see the dates when those kings reigned. So if we were in a classroom and you were a little closer to me, this would be more of a conversation, but I hope that you notice that something jumps out to you about those 2 kings and those 2 reigns. That is quite a long tenure for a king at any time in history, but especially in the ancient world. 40-year-long reigns is quite unusual and suggests something about the time period. And then we know that the biblical authors, the inhabitants of ancient Israel and Judah, always lived under the threat and thumb of major imperial superpowers. But this happens to be a time period when the major dominant imperial force, which is from northern Iraq or northern Mesopotamia, known as Assyria, between 843 and 745, did not have much of a presence in the area. And so that all nicely corresponds to one another, where you can see that there is probably some reason why you have these long reigns of these kings has to do with the lack of imperial pressure, and that it may also suggest a kind of period of peace, stability, prosperity over decades. So this is the time when Amos is set by this first verse, and we're told that he was among the shepherds of Tekoa. So Tekoa is a city in the south, in the southern kingdom of Judah. But in the only story we get about Amos, it sounds as though he prophesies at the northern kingdom of Israel's national sanctuary in Bethel. So we're going to skip ahead to a little prose, seemingly anecdotal story stuck in the middle of chapter 7, and then we'll come back and work our way more chapter by chapter through the book. But you learn a little bit more about Amos's biography from this little episode in chapter 7, which is a sort of showdown. I'm in Colorado, right? So showdown at the OK Corral's got to be somewhere over there near Colorado. But this is the showdown at the Bethel Corral or Bethel Temple between Amaziah, the high priest of the National Cathedral, and Amos, this southern shepherd from a very small village known as Tekoa. And other later prophetic books are going to be much more interested and give us much more information about the biographies of the prophets. But Amos is pretty much exclusively a collection of things Amos said with very little. But here you get Amaziah in verse 10. So right in the middle of all this poetry and visions, in verse 10, we get a story in prose about the high priest sending news to the king. Remember who the king of the northern kingdom of Israel is? Jeroboam. Happens to be Jeroboam II. And Amaziah, high priest, tells King Jeroboam that Amos, in verse 10, has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel, and the land is not able to bear his words. So that's an interesting formulation, that the land is not able to bear his words, but also what is the high priest doing by telling the king that Amos is speaking in the very center of the house of Israel, and the land is not able to bear his words, for thus Amos has said. And then he quotes to the king something Amos has said, which actually isn't found exactly like this anywhere else in Amos, but we don't always get our quotations right. So he sends news to the king that Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel will go into exile away from its land. So the message to the king is putting a target, so to speak, on Amos's back. And we're not told how the king responds to this, but we sort of cut, if we're still in the film metaphor, back to the center of the house of Israel, which is how one might talk about a kingdom's capital city or temple. And there we find Amos and Amaziah in verse 12 in a confrontation with each other. Amaziah says to Amos, go home, boy, go back where you're from. We don't tune in to that station up here. You've said some very bad things about this kingdom and this king and this administration. And we don't want to hear that. And so specifically, he says, see or go, flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel. And then notice how the high priest describes the sanctuary and the temple. Don't prophesy again at Bethel, which is where the temple was located of the northern kingdom of Israel. For it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. So one could imagine a priest describing a temple very differently than a temple of the king and a temple of the kingdom. That would be as a temple of God. But that is not how this high priest, that's not how you talk about the cathedral when you're at the National Cathedral. This is the National Cathedral, not God's cathedral. So Amaziah tells Amos to go home, earn his bread there, and never again prophesy at the king's sanctuary. So this is not just a conflict between prophet and priest. The concern here is very much with the words, consequences of Amos's words for the sovereignty and legitimacy of the royal administration. So Amos then responds to Amaziah by saying, I'm not a prophet, which is a hilarious line. I hope you didn't miss it. This is in a prophetic book. It has Amos, who is definitely a prophet, saying, I am not a prophet. And then, why are we talking about Amos, right? Because he is a prophet. So what does he mean by this? I'm not a prophet or a prophet's son. When it says that in NRSV, Tim, I believe, talks about this and talking about how there can be different sorts of prophets, some more central and some more peripheral, some more are trained to be professional prophets, and some are more uncredentialed outsiders who just show up with a voice from God and a message from God, and that is the basis of their legitimacy. Of course, they need a hearing and support from others as well, but you do find different kinds of prophets, and so Amos responds by apparently saying, I'm not a professional prophet. I'm a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees, which reminds us of him having been described as a shepherd, and the Lord took me from following the flock. So apparently not only a shepherd, but also an orchard keeper of sorts, and told me to go prophesy to my people Israel. So this is a very interesting little window on, we don't know a lot from this, but it makes one wonder, could one be called to be a prophet? You know, there are many people, Tim and I and Clover and Stephanie went to seminary with, who had been practicing law for 5 years and then decided that this was terrible for their soul and they needed to go to seminary and pursue ministry, or they had been in some other profession. And so it's interesting to think that one might be able to be called to be a prophet. But the message from Amos to Amaziah in this episode is clear that he's not in this for the money. He's not doing this because he wants to. If you remember, Rabbi Mo said, no good Jewish boy wants to be a prophet, or no good Jewish girl wants to be a prophet. I'm not doing this because I asked for it or want to do it or need the money that I may or may not be getting from it. I was perfectly happy keeping my trees and my flocks, and God called me to come to Israel to speak this word. And then in verse 16 is when Amos really lays it home for Amaziah, poor guy. Basically, he says, now therefore, and whenever a prophet says therefore, you should duck in your pew. If Clover's ever reading, get out of the way because it's coming. Therefore, Amaziah, you said, don't prophesy against Israel, don't preach against Isaac. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, your wife shall become a prostitute, your sons shall fall by the sword, your land will be parceled out, you will die in an unclean land, and Israel shall still surely go into exile. So it's still going to happen. Putting the target on my back with the king has not changed anything. Telling me to leave has not changed anything. You're still going to go into exile, and now all these awful things are going to happen to this poor high priest of the national cathedral because he momentarily tried to stop the inevitable destruction. So that is what we know about Amos. He prophesied in the north, but is from the south. And it did not go well, as it typically does not go well with prophets, as we've heard multiple times. And then the book is divided fairly cleanly, as far as biblical prophetic literature goes, into three clear sections. And I'm gonna speed up a little bit and flip around. So keep your eyes on the text with me, and you'll see how patterned and repetitious and clear these sections seem to be, at least in many parts. So we start off with oracles concerning nations, so multiple nations, not just Israel or Judah, where Amos is from, although they are part of the list. Then in 3 to 6, you get a series of chapters that include a number of judgment oracles against the northern kingdom of Israel primarily. Chapters 7 through 9 contain 5 visions of judgment. The first 4 are symbolic visions, and then the last one doesn't have symbolism, but it's still a vision of something Amos sees. And there's a surprising vision at the end, and I put in there so you can see that little prose story is just sort of stuck in there in a larger section that's dominated by visions Amos has. So we start off by being introduced in 1:1 to the words of Amos which he saw, and then the 2 big sections are going to be judgment oracles spoken, and then visions connected to speech, oracular speech, things that Amos says, but primarily oriented around a visionary experience. Okay, so we've talked about the Amaziah showdown. That's the first of the highlight reel, web gems, whatever you want to call it. I'm gonna pull from Amos and make you interested. And I'm walking through just chapters 1 after that introductory verse, and 2. And if you skim this section of Amos, you will see that it is very repetitious. So chapter 3, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of, and then we're going to get a place, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. And then flip to, and that the city there is Damascus. And you flip to verse 6. So this is just a couple of verses later. For 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. Then verse 9, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they blah, blah, blah. And verse 11, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because he pursued his brother with the sword and cast off all. So you get this clear introduction to different cities that are capital cities or representative cities of larger peoples. And the oracle begins the same way each time, and we'll through 4 of them, I think, but it continues with others. And each time you get a list of 3 or 4 things, and then you're going to get because they did, and you're expecting 3 or 4 things in that list. And then Amos says they will be punished. So if you imagine coming to Bethel and hearing Amos speak, you are hearing a very patterned, repetitious sermon here. It might not be a sermon. They might all be collected here together at the beginning because they're similar to each other in terms of being oracles concerning other nations. But if you imagine reading them as consecutive oracles concerning different peoples, then we start with Damascus, which, as you all know, because it's still an important city in Syria, is Syria, not Assyria, which is up and over here in Mesopotamia, but Damascus. And then second, if you remember, I said Gaza. So down here, the Philistines, the coastal peoples. And then the third place I mentioned is up here at Tyre in Phoenicia, another coastal people that's similar to but different than the Israelites and the Judaites. So we're sort of working our way around from Syria down to Philistia to Phoenicia. And then I said Edom, the Edomites, right way down here, and then the Ammonites right here. And each time the criticism from Amos is about war crimes, well, international offensive behavior, the slave trade, taking people from one people and selling them to another. So these are interesting indictments for these other peoples to the Israelites about things other people have done that has invoked God's punishment of them. And the places sort of spiral from Syria to Philistia to Phoenicia to Edom to Ammon to Moab and then to Judah. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to click that. To Judah and Jerusalem. And that is the seventh. You all know 7 is a nice biblical number. You might be expecting our sermon to end with Judah, and we're all in Bethel in Israel, and that all sounds nice, doesn't it? It's about time those Phoenicians got what was coming to them, and everybody knows that the Edomites never should have done that. And this is how you maybe talk about, like, I don't know, people from Wyoming or New Mexico or I don't know what it is in Colorado. Maybe it's just eastern Colorado and western Colorado, but this is a very small area, and you're hearing a sermon about all these things that other people have done that our God, only our God, not their God, is going to punish them for. So in the background is something like, as I suggest here, like it's sort of universal declaration of human rights, or a universal sense of morality, or a universal sense that you just shouldn't do that. And so you're going to be punished. Maybe there was no law in Philistia against what Amos indicts them for. We don't know. It might not be against the law, but it's wrong. And you'll be punished for it. So all of that sounds great if we're in Bethel. The problem is that Amos doesn't stop with number 7. If you remember, it's 3 plus 1 for 3 plus transgressions of Gaza and for 4. And now we get 7. And if you think you're getting out of church early to hit the restaurant before the Baptists get there or whatever, you're out of luck, because Amos keeps talking, and you better sit back down, because the last and not least in the list, of course, is the northern kingdom of Israel, which comes for the longest and gets the longest and most sustained attack, criticism. And it is not the same as the other nations received. It is focused on domestic policy, social policy, economic exploitation of their own people. And it is a list, one after another, of all. So you sit back down and get comfortable. And now you realize that whole spiral of all those people was spiraling in on you the whole time in Israel's capital city of Samaria and National Cathedral in Bethel. So those are the first 2 chapters. It's a pretty good opening for the book of Amos. And then next up on the highlight reel, how are we doing on time? 12:07? Okay. Next up, we get strong denunciations of social injustice and immorality, moral decay, that are deeply informed by a strong sense of class consciousness, the stratification in society. So Tim and Todd and Mo all, I think, in different ways talked about the attention the prophets give to the marginalized, the vulnerable, and so to the forces that cause vulnerability and marginalization as well, which is often the elites. And so it is not only, there's also status and position and offices and other dynamics involved, but the prophets are particularly attuned to class dynamics. So Amos has some of these to be expected strong denunciations of social injustice. Here's one example: alas, or woe to those who lie on beds of ivory, who lounge on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the stall. Whoa, 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 whoa. To all of you who eat meat all the time, woe to you who sit around on your couches and listen to music. Woe to you who watch the Broncos. Woe to you. This is Amos. Notice what he's criticizing. I think he might blow a gasket if he came to the United States, but he sees and people sitting around, lounging, drinking wine, eating meat, anointing themselves with the finest oils. And this, though, is the problem. This is where you, I think, really get to the hook onto what is the problem. It is that not only all of this, but how all of this has numbed them to their neighbor. They are not grieved over the ruin of their neighbors. Therefore, and then, of course, you're all ready to duck now. You shall go away into exile. You think you're like David. You think you're like the king in revelry and lounging. Well, you're going to be like David, all right, when you lose your kingdom and are led away in exile, just as David himself was also deposed. So this is just a piece of inlaid ivory that has been found. So the capital city of Samaria, of this northern kingdom, is destroyed within decades of Amos's career. And it has been thoroughly excavated. It was a major city with monumental architecture and very nice luxury items, such as that little inlaid ivory piece that would have gone in someone's chair, such as these chairs. And this is an Assyrian king. I'm hoping you can see my cursor. Maybe. Can you see? Yeah. You get an Assyrian king and queen drinking out of bowls, lounging on and being attended to by people waving fans. And just don't miss this. This is somebody's severed head in this tree, because when I'm with my wife having a cuppa, we like to, stage the surroundings properly. And then, so you see Israelite and Judaic, perhaps kings, wanting to live like big, major imperial superpowers. Here's another piece of carved ivory from Phoenicia, and a line drawing showing you what's there, with a king drinking from bowls and listening to music, and exactly the kinds of things that Amos seems to be describing, which don't sound like terribly egregious sins, is my point about the Broncos. It's not really that I don't like NFL football. It's that it doesn't seem like it's a particularly problematic thing to do, to have a little wine and sit around and listen to some music. There may be more going on that makes it problematic in this case. Here is another example where Amos attacks people for their hypocritical and insincere, inauthentic fulfillment of religious practices, only so that they can get them out of the way and move on with their day, to get a little here, pinch a little off the top there, squeeze a little bit here, make sure I get a great deal there, so that I can continue to make more and more wealth at a time when there are needy and poor who are being deceived. It's not terribly egregious, but it's without concern for, and in fact causing people to remain in cycles of poverty. So here's another example, not so much of someone saying, oh, when can the Sabbath be over so that I can get back to the marketplace and make some more money? But in this case, woe to you, again, alas, I don't love that translation, but woe sounds better, to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It's darkness, not light. It's as if, and here again, you find some of what the poetry, the playfulness, that these prophets, they are very concerned about social issues, but they are not only social justice warriors. This is poetry, and it can be playful, and this is a hilarious scenario where Amos imagines the Lord coming back, and these people, pious people who want the Lord to come back, have no idea that it's going to be as bad for them as if they ran into a lion, ran away from it, and encountered a bear, finally making it to their home, only to rest their hand on the wall and be bitten by a snake. That you're not getting away from it. That's what's going to happen. It's darkness, not light. Didn't you hear that the first time he said it? The next verse, I despise your festival. You can offer offerings as much as you want. You can pray prayers all day long. I will not listen to them. I cannot stand your worship services. That's what God says, according to Amos. It is rather shocking to hear these words in the mouth of the Lord, who we know very much enjoyed being worshiped and receiving sacrifices. And yet there are passages in the prophets with very strong denunciations of religious practices, and that can sound like they are anti-religious. I don't think that is right. I think that there are moral and social concerns that God has in the Bible. If you think about the Ten Commandments, for example, the first 3 are about worshiping God correctly, and the final 6 are about relations with your neighbor, and the middle one is about Sabbath, which is about both worshiping God, who kept Sabbath at creation, and having good relations with your neighbors, who should not work 7 days a week, but should have time to watch the Broncos. No, I'm not sure how Amos would think about that, but this is the prophets criticizing religious practices, not simply because I think the prophets think that the religious practices are wrong, but because people are practicing religious obligations in the midst of a social environment where people are losing their livelihoods, they're losing their land, they're being impoverished. Others are collecting, accumulating excessive amounts of wealth and preserving it with military might. And this is so upsetting to God that God can't even stand to hear the sounds of your terrible music or your pathetic prayers. Go out there and fix the social injustice and moral decay. And then I think the prophets probably could get on board with fulfilling religious practices. That's why I have at the top of the slide here moral and religious practices, and then here the primacy of morality. There's the sense that Jesus said, go reconcile with your neighbor first, and then come worship in the temple. There's a kind of priority to these practices. They are not all the same. Okay, third. So that's chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. You have these strong criticisms of the people that raise interesting dynamics about the role that religion and politics and prophets and the economy and all these things played with one another. We've seen the showdown. Now we've seen the strong prophetic oracles of judgment. And finally, we get in 7, 8, and 9 to the 5 visions. And then one that's at the very last thing that you see in the book of Amos is another vision. It's a vision of restoration and hope, not of judgment. So we will get there in a second. But first, I call them symbolic visions, thinking that you had Bibles and you would flip with me through these quickly. But that just means that they're introduced with a visionary experience. This is what the Lord God showed me. So you're going to hear that 5 times in a row. This is 7:1. This is what the Lord God showed me. He was forming locusts at the time of the latter growth. Blah, blah, blah. And then what does Amos see? Amos is going to see locusts devouring the crop. And this is God's judgment. And here, the prophet doesn't say, and you deserve it, and it's because you did this. And instead, the prophet intercedes with God to say, oh, God, please don't. And Moses does this. This is another thing. The prophets don't always act the same way either. And God relents. And then this is what the Lord God showed me in verse 4, chapter 7. The Lord God was calling for a shower of fire. And I said, oh, Lord, cease, I beg you. Then in verse 7, 2 verses later, this is what he showed me. The Lord was standing beside a wall with a plumb line. So each time the fire is symbolic of something, the locusts are symbolic of something, and now the plumb line is going to be a symbol for something related to the message that Amos brings. Only this time, God doesn't give Amos time to say, oh, Lord, please relent. God just keeps talking over anything Amos might have wanted to say in order to say, I will never again pass them by. They will be destroyed, and I will destroy the house of Jeroboam with the sword. So that is the end of verse 9, the third of the 5 visions. And that is where verse 10 shows up with the Amos-Amaziah showdown. So you can see why it appears to be stuck at that moment. It's because Amos just said, or God just said through Amos, and they will be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. And then Amaziah sends word to the king that Amos is saying, you're going to be assassinated. And you're going to lose the kingdom. And so that's why this little prose story seems to be stuck right there, because it sounds like what Amos said when he tells Jeroboam what he said. Then in chapter 8, verse 1, after we skip past that prose story, this is what the Lord God showed me. And this time, it is, here I put this one up, because this one is the hardest one to understand because it's not a clear symbol like the others are. A basket of summer fruit. And he said, Amos, what do you see? And I said, kites. It's only one word in Hebrew. It gets this expansive. Kites, a basket of summer fruit. And then God says, Kates is upon my people Israel. The end is upon my people Israel. So I was trying to think of a good example of this, and the best I could come up with was the opposite. What if it were the opposite? And what if Amos sees something from God, and it is like a fireplace, great, and then God says, great things will come to Israel. Obviously, these words are homonyms and do not mean the same thing. There's not a symbolism between the fire great and the great things that are coming. It is simply the sound of the word that connects the vision of what is seen to the content of what is said. So it is, I like that one, but it takes a little work to unpack it. And then you can see at the end, the dead bodies shall be many, cast out in every place. Be quiet. Then the 5th one, it is as if God has no time for symbolism anymore, and instead, this is what Amos sees: the Lord, and it is the direct destruction, and there is no escape. You can climb to heaven or climb down to hell and reach up to heaven as far as you want. God will pull you down and pick you up and make sure that you receive the just punishment that you deserve. So this is an ancient picture of Amos. It's definitely how he looked, even though it was drawn much later. You probably know this story of the Lorax who speaks for the trees. I hope you know Dr. Seuss stories because you had parents that loved you and read to you, or you read them to your grandkids or children. The story here, like in Horton, like in other Dr. Seuss stories, is of someone who speaks for someone else who can't be heard or won't be heard or won't be paid attention to in ways that lead to great ecological disaster in the case of the Lorax, or the loss of a whole civilization in the case of the Who's with Horton, and we could go on. But this is a good picture, I think, of a prophet as someone who speaks for those who have no voices, who won't and can't be heard, and the old onceler who's just trying to make some sneeds because everybody needs them, and it might cause a little bit of harm for the brown barbaloots and the swami swans and so on, but you can't worry too much about that when people need needs and business must grow because business is business, you know. And it ends with this one specifically with very little hope. Do you remember the book ends with the word of the Lorax, which sounds like the word of the Lord? I hope you hear when you hear prophetic speech. I mean, you hear that now in the context of speaking about prophets. The word of the Lord acts is unless, and so that's not much. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. So here's the last of the truffle seeds. So that's hope, and that is all you get in Amos as well. We are out of time, so I would go through this more. But if you look in chapter 5, which is the middle chapter of the 9 chapters of Amos, you have 3 little places where Amos seems to speak the way most other prophets speak, that you can seek the Lord and live, that you could change your life, and there could be an alternative future for you. Mostly, Amos is unique because he just speaks of this as a foregone conclusion that you will be punished, suffer destruction, and yet the book ends with a final vision of promise and restoration, which is a very beautiful agricultural little poem, especially the one in 13, 14, 15, which with beautiful literary devices. And Amos is an odd book in the Hebrew Bible because most other books are very much more balanced between judgment and promise, between destruction and restoration. And Amos has very little of the promise and restoration. But thinking of Amos as the first, it may be that later prophets realized that we need more of that as well as the judgment and destruction. So I love the book of Amos. Thanks for listening. Sorry to go 2 minutes past 12:20, but thanks again for inviting me. I hope you get into Amos and other books.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Davis. You want to unshare your screen so we can see your face a little better? Oopsie, there you are. All right, good. Thanks so much, Davis. That was amazing, and I think you probably will have sent us all back to the text with some handles to understand it. I was really struck by the way you brought in, keeping an eye out for repetitions and the ways that create structure within these texts. So thank you very much. And I think the main takeaway was you shouldn't watch the Broncos, but the Nuggets are okay. I think that's what you were saying. I think that's what Amos was saying. Anyway, we have some time for questions, and Mary Jo has got the mic for some conversation with you.
Well, I guess I'll ask a question, and this will show how little I know about the Bible. If Amos is saying all these prophecies, I feel like I can feel a lot of parallels with today and some of the things he was railing against in our political system. Did his prophecies have any impact? Did it make a difference?
That is something we wish we knew so often. We see, I mean, that one story is clearly there are political consequences for what Amos is saying, and Amos is taken to be a legitimate threat by the most powerful folks in the land. So uh, there's at least a perception of threat that we can see there. Otherwise, and this is true for many prophetic books, we have no idea whether these people were taken seriously in their own time, or pushed back again. I mean, I'm sure it was complicated. We do have other episodes. There are great stories in the book of Jeremiah of his run-ins with authorities in prose stories. So there are plenty of them, but there are plenty of texts like Amos where we don't know. But that episode in chapter 7, verses 10 to 17 of Amos and Amaziah's conflict is at least suggests that he wasn't dismissed as some southern loony bird. That's kind of what I worry sometimes when you read the NRSV translation is he has conspired against you, is that people might risk thinking of like conspiracy theorists who connect yarn in their backyard shed and wear tinfoil hats and have all the newspaper clippings tied together. And that is not what this word means here. This word is almost always used in the northern kingdom of Israel, almost always for a coup that is almost always successful in deposing the current reigning king of Israel from his throne and establishing a new leader in his place. So we know that Amos was taken seriously. We know from the story it suggests that he was told to go home, and then we move on and we don't know. But there are other texts where we can see some of that play out. It's a great question because uh, there are prophetic voices that can be more consequential and less consequential. And sometimes people can be speaking prophetically in a social media post or something, and it's not a very consequential, in my opinion, typically uh, um, voicing of their position, and other voices that can be more consequential, important in building alliances, and so helping shape prophetic movement. So I think we can learn from the prophets with these questions in mind.
Davis, I was just thinking a follow-up question in terms of context that might be helpful for us. Some of the folks here probably have heard a little bit about the northern and the southern kingdom, and others might not even really know about that ancient Israel divided into two different kingdoms. Could you give a little context for that, and basically what happens to the northern kingdom of Israel, also called Samaria, after Amos?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question too. So the consequences come, that's for sure. And it is not long after Amos is set for us. Remember, in 740, then that's when the Neo-Assyrian Empire from Mesopotamia, so northern Iraq, begins to reestablish control over these little kingdoms. And Israel and Judah were separate kingdoms; they had split. So same, they remembered going back to the same peoples and worshiping the same God, but in two separate states. And the Assyrians reestablished control over these little, smaller sort of counties like kingdoms, some of which, like Israel, had a significant army and wealth and capital city and monumental architecture, but it's not big like Egypt. It's not big like Assyria, but it's pretty significant regional power holder and wealth, um, and they are in fact powerful enough to withhold their taxes and tribute money from Assyria once Assyria is back established as the imperial power, collecting annual tribute and in the form of resources, wealth, goods, and people who will help build the big capital cities. If you go to the London Museum, you will see evidence from the palaces of the Assyrian kings. And where did that wealth come from? Where did that labor come from? It came from them conquering in a kind of unsustainable, ultimately imperial extractive regime from other peoples that are being plundered through tribute payments or not. And so at times when they would get enough alliances and enough wealth and enough power to think that they could resist, they would. And so the Northern Kingdom did it first in 722. That's just 2 decades after Amos. And then the Southern Kingdom of Judah, 150 years later, will do the same thing against the Babylonians, which is the exile that, of course, is the one you prominently hear about in church with the 586 destruction of Jerusalem by the southern Iraq Babylonian peoples after they take the Assyrian territory. So the northern kingdom of Israel will be turned into a province with a governor appointed by Assyria, with no king and no kingdom by 722. And then the southern kingdom of Judah really expands after that. And you can see evidence of the population explosion. And so they will flourish for about in the 600s until they withhold tribute, and the Babylonians come with Nebuchadnezzar's armies and retaliate with massive devastation and destruction.
Thank you. Other questions? Got to get you the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for your overview, Amos. Appreciate it. Just a question outside of Amos. So, can you explain the difference between, or if there is a difference between the Jews that are in Israel right now and the Jews that was there back in the time of biblical antiquity? Is there a difference in what's happening?
Yes. So this is not, of course, my area, but as you know, the modern nation state of Israel was created in 1948 in the wake of World War II, and realizations about the destruction of European Jewry and the Holocaust or Shoah, and that many of the people who moved into Israel were from the Pale of Settlement in Ukraine and Russia and Eastern European places where Jews had lived for many Jews had lived, Ashkenazi Jews, for a long time prior to the foundation of the modern nation state of Israel, and they resurrected the language of Hebrew in order to create modern Hebrew. So there's not a direct line of continuity between the modern nation state of Israel and modern Hebrew, with ancient Israel, ancient Judah, ancient Jews, and ancient Hebrew. But of course, these relationships come into play often in ideological debates about who has the right to the land. And throughout, Israel remembers having lived in the land with other people. Sometimes they did so in ways where both peoples were able to flourish, sometimes where people were in conflict. So the Bible does provide, I think, good resources for thinking about pitfalls and promises of how one might better or worse live alongside one's neighbors in ways that flourish despite differences.
So there was no there was no such thing as the Middle East until World War II. There was Northeast Africa. Am I right? So
Yeah.
How did that become?
Well, the Ottoman Empire controlled Palestine, and then there was a British mandate from the UN, so the Britons controlled it, and then they wanted to not control it anymore after World War II, and so the UN helped them found. So the modern nation state and those lines and the lines between Palestinians and Israel right now, all those lines, yes, are products of the 20th century. But of course, there was the land and there were peoples living all around the Mediterranean world for thousands of years. And
It was considered Northeast Africa, not Middle East.
Sometimes South.
To the Suez Canal that was made in 1869. There was no Middle East.
Okay. I don't know what that is.
You don't know about that? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I don't. If you could say more if you want.
No, I'm saying that in 1869, man made the Suez Canal. There was no such thing as the Middle East. It was Northeast Africa. Why did that happen? And now we're calling it the Middle East.
Well, I think that primarily happened to get oil to British troops who were conquering Egypt at the time. But again, this is way after my period. But that is my general understanding of what Britain, France, Russia are all doing in the Middle East in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Just trying to control resources and move oil. And that's when we're beginning to be really dependent on petroleum in the late 19th century.
Thank goodness that's over. All right. Well, Davis, want to say thank you again for this very enlightening talk and lesson and engagement, and for engaging our questions as well. And we'll hope to see you here again. I'll take you to a Nuggets game if you come. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for having me.
Thanks, you all.